Hello everybody. It is a gray and not cold, but just dreary morning. I am not quite awake yet, and I'm staring at a list of 20 books that I need to wrap up in order to catch up with all the stuff I've been reading so far and get back to my usual weekly wrap-up schedule. So, I hope you like wrap-up videos. I'm going to be barraging you with about 4 of them over the coming week, since I've split up my list of 20 things to talk about into 5 book chunks, and hopefully that makes these videos not horrendously long, she said before they were all 20 minutes long. I am not good at being brief here recently. But anyway, yeah, January has been just an excellent reading month, and February promises to be more of the same. I'm just churning through a bunch of things. I'm reading quite a few books that I own as well, so I'm very happy about all of this, but it does mean that doing big wrap-ups is a little bit daunting. So without any further ado, let's get into this. The first book I have to talk about in this batch is Good Omens, The Nice and Accurate Prophecies of Agnes Nutter Witch. This is by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. It is famously like their one collaboration, and this is my 3rd time rereading it, and this time, though I own the physical book, I reread it on audio. It's been a while since I have read the book itself. The last time I experienced the story was through like a BBC radio production, which I really enjoyed, and it was an adaptation. It wasn't 100% all the material. So then I came to listening to this on audiobook, and I was surprised at some of the things I'd forgotten, but also it just felt like a really familiar and well-loved story. I do think that the humor in this book works better for me in print than on audio for some reason, though. I just kept thinking to myself, I thought this was funnier when I read the book rather than listening to the audiobook. It was still a good experience though, and I enjoyed it a lot. Then I read a nonfiction book with a very long title. It was The Future of Humanity, Terraforming Mars, Interstellar Travel, Immortality, and Our Destiny Beyond Earth by Michio Kaku. And given that subtitle, I think that tells you everything that this book actually covers. It's a lot about the current state of technology and various innovations and stuff, and Kaku talking about whether we have what it takes yet to do some of these things like terraforming Mars. And it was very interesting. I was mainly interested in this because I wanted an up-to-date description of the state of certain fields and technologies, and that's what I got from it. But it's been a couple weeks since I read it, and it's surprisingly unmemorable. I don't know, I've had this experience twice with Kaku's books. I've forgotten about them very quickly after reading them. Possibly this is because I listened to it on audiobook rather than in print, and also I'm familiar with a lot of these concepts because they are not surprisingly pretty common in science fiction, and Kaku actually talks quite a bit about science fiction, including a famous book by Olaf Stapledon called Star Maker, which I want to read now. So there is definitely that connection between the topics he's discussing here and science fiction, so maybe that's why I was actually more knowledgeable about this than I thought I was. So yeah, it was a decent book and quite good to listen to on audio. I'm not sure what it is with me and forgetting Kaku's books so quickly. Next, I read kind of a science fiction thriller book called ZeroSum Game by S.L. Huang. This is the first in her Russell's Attic series, which was all originally self-published. So this version of ZeroSum Game that I read is the 2018 edition from Tor. I've never read any of the original books in the series. I can't speak to how it might be different. But I am going to continue on with the series as Tor republishes and redoes the series. So ZeroSum Game is about a woman named Cass Russell. I hope I remembered her first name. I just think of her as Russell, who has, well, basically her superpower is math. I mean, she's highly trained with like weapons and stuff too, but she experiences the whole world as basically mathematical formulas and algorithms, and she's able to do some pretty wacky, crazy stuff because she can just calculate all the trajectories and things like that. It comes across like an actual superhero superpower, like it might almost not be scientific. It's so much like magic sometimes, which is probably one of my main problems with this book. I enjoyed the tension, I enjoyed the running around and the conspiracies and trying to evade being killed while you're figuring out what's going on and everything, but I had a really hard time suspending my disbelief about Russell's abilities, which is weird for me. Usually I'm pretty good at just accepting something, but I think it just hit exactly in that gray area where it's difficult to determine if her abilities are magical and a little bit supernatural or actually scientific and science fiction. I did like the pace of it, and I thought this was a great female character who, it doesn't matter really that she's a woman, she's just really good at what she does. But by the end of it, I really wish that there were other women in the story. Russell pretty much teams up with a group of men, and I couldn't help but think, how would this dynamic be different if Russell had another woman to interact with and work with? That could be really interesting. So I hope that there are more female characters in the remainder of the series. So it was decent. It had some flaws, but it really piqued my interest for what might come later. And I've also read some of Huang's short stories and really liked them, so I think she's a writer that I really want to follow at this point. Next up is Modern Masters of Science Fiction, Lois, McMaster, Bujold by Edward James. As you may know at this point, because I keep going on about her, Bujold is one of my favorite authors of all time, and her Vorkosigan saga series, which is science fiction, is one of my favorite series of all time as well. So I will pretty much read anything about Bujold or that has her name on it. I've also been very interested in reading these Modern Masters of Science Fiction books because they are really interesting critical analyses of an author's work and also kind of their biography and things like that. This is the third one in the series I've read so far, and it's the first one I've read where the author that's under discussion is still alive, and that I think really affects the way the author approached his subject matter. The two previous ones I've read have been on Ian M. Banks and Octavia Butler, and those were very focused on the author's life, their biography, and the time at which they were writing certain works and how that affected things. So those books were really arranged in publication order and in life chronological order. This one is less like that and much more focused on major themes in Bujold's work, both her science fiction and her fantasy, because there are some really interesting similarities and comparisons to be made across the genre there. I really liked the more thematic approach in this. I just like that the book was more structured around that, because when I read these books, while I read them in internal chronological order, I was really paying more attention to this just sequence of events rather than themes, and this really brought some things to my attention that I hadn't noticed myself when I read them the first time. So it's made me very interested in reading her books again, looking more for these themes and recurring threads and stuff like that. This was a very interesting read, but I had to knock off a star because I just think that it was missing some things because it was published before major conclusions or continuations of Bujold's works. So yeah, I think there are actually some other books written on Bujold and her work, and I might track down some of them, though they sound like they're probably a little bit less accessible and a little bit more extremely academic. This is actually very readable. And the last book I have to talk about in this batch is Mort by Terry Pratchett. I am tackling my reread of Discworld again, and this time I'm focusing on reading the sub-series in internal chronological order. So Mort is the first book in the Death sub-series, which focuses on the anthropomorphic representation of death. So in this one, Death takes a human boy, Mort, as his apprentice, and Death kind of like gets to go on a vacation for the first time in 1,000 years, and Mort begins to grow into the vacancy in this role that Death has left behind. So it's almost like Death is becoming a bit more human and Mort is becoming a bit more not. There were so many things about this book that I had forgotten about. In fact, one of the few things I remembered was Death's line, "I could murder a curry." I don't know why that stuck with me. But I had forgotten everything about where Mort came from, how he ended up being Death's apprentice. I had forgotten everything about Death's adopted daughter. Though I knew that she existed, I had forgotten how that came about. I had just, I've reread Hogfather so much that I was always knowing more about Susan, who is Death's granddaughter and like that generation instead. I did notice, however, that this is one of the earlier written Discworld novels, and Pratchett wasn't as good a writer. It feels a little bit off in some ways. And I also noticed that Death as a character has really evolved too. I've always really been more familiar with the later Death books after some of his evolution, so he was a little bit different in here, not as kind actually as I remembered him being, which just goes to show that Pratchett managed to make even Death have a character arc and evolve as a person, you know? So yeah, it was really great, and I'll be reading the next one, Reaper Man, very soon. That is it for this batch of books. Let me know if you have read any of these, or if you want to, leave me a comment down below, and I will talk to you again very soon in the next wrap up, and until then, bye.